What I'm going to do today is to give you, as Mike said, an overview of many of the maps in the exhibit. The exhibit itself is divided into 3 separate parts. The first part are Portolan maps or charts, which we'll talk about in a moment. Those are on the ground floor. And then on the mezzanine level, we have vitrines, which have mostly maps in books. And then we have 2 curved cases. One of those curved cases is devoted to forgeries in maps. The Beinecke is perhaps fortunate, it depends on your point of view, to have several forged maps. And on October 10th, if you join me here for a webinar, we're going to have a webinar that's entitled The Last Word on the Vinland Map, ? Across from that, the other curved case has Asian maps. And those are maps that are outside the range of this exhibit because we don't have early manuscript maps of Asia, but they help to give you a sense of different peoples and the way in which they drew the world around them. So I'm going to start my slides now, and at the end of the session, I will answer as best I can any questions that you have. To begin with, I wanted to let you know that this exhibit was co-curated by Kristen Herdman and myself. Kristen Herdman is an advanced graduate student in medieval studies at Yale. She participated as a scholar in the mentorship program that we ran last year. And she did everything with me from soup to nuts, from picking out materials to conservation review to writing labels. And we've allowed the different voices between myself and Kristen to stand in the exhibit so that it addresses different people, because we obviously have very different styles. So I wanted to thank her for her devotion and the work that she's put into this. Overall, the exhibition is a celebration of the map library and the Beinecke library coming together and having all of the maps in the map library relocated. There are a lot of different ways to celebrate this, but my particular fascination is with manuscript maps. And so that's what we're going to be looking at here. And I'm interested in maps primarily as cultural objects. That is, how do maps locate us in the world? How do people create maps, and what are they saying about their place in the world? And then how do others read those maps? And often misread those maps. So that's my fundamental assumption here, is that we're going to be looking at different points of view that are expressed by these maps from the period roughly 1400 to 1600. Obviously, the big break there is 1492, when Columbus encounters what we call the New World. Obviously, this was not a discovery for the peoples that lived in the New World, but it was for Europeans. And it did change the scope of their mapping and then eventually the way in which they mapped. And so all of the maps here that we're going to be looking at, which are divided into Portolan charts, TO maps or medieval maps, and Ptolemaic maps, all of those give way to different types of mapping in the modern period. I did just want to give a shout out to Carrie Sancombe and Megan Checky for mounting the exhibit. They were the ones that took the very rough things that you see here and made them into a beautiful exhibit, and to Rebecca Mertz for working with me on designing the labels and the brochure. So what I'd like to do today is to talk about the different ways people mapped in Europe in the late medieval period, so before 1492. What you see is probably very hazy, and it's not the fault of your monitor or of my image. This is a very large map. It is about 4 feet by 5 feet. And because of some process or some varnish that's been placed on it, the map itself is darkened considerably. So what you're looking at there is a map of the world, and it's called a Ptolemaic map because it's based on maps from the ancient astronomer and geographer Ptolemy. And what you can see to your left is Africa, and above Africa is Europe. You might be able to see Italy with the boot there to the top, and then Spain to the left. And you'll notice that Africa extends out, and you can see the end of Africa, So what this means is that people, the Portuguese in particular, have actually gone around Africa at this point, and they've started to explore the Indian Ocean. This map is dated to sometime around 1490. We're not exactly sure. The map itself isn't dated, but it's a very, very important map. And it shows you a little bit why Columbus thought that the trip to the New World or to Japan was going to be a lot shorter than it turned out to be. Columbus knew that this map didn't really represent the world, that the world was in fact bigger than this map portrays it, but he did think the circumference of the world was smaller than it in fact turned out to be. One of the speakers that will be up and coming, his name is Chet Van Duzer, and what Chet did was he and his team brought cameras and photographed the map under multiple light conditions. In the ultraviolet and infrared spectra that our eyes can't see, and then a computer puts those together into materials that we can see. And this is the result with, it's called false color added, so that the ocean isn't blue, even though that's not one of the colors that turns up. And you can see what this map sort of looked like in its original form. And I wanted to show you a manuscript map by Martellus from right around the same period in the British Library. Now, obviously, this is a lot smaller. It's in a book, as you can see, and you can also see, if you were to compare it with the last one, that this map was done before that earlier map. And the way you can tell is if you look at the southern coast of Africa, they've definitely gone around the Cape of Good Hope, but they've stopped sort of halfway through. They haven't made it very far into the Indian Ocean yet. And so this is an earlier stage of the map that Martellus drew. But unlike the Martellus map that we have, it's much easier to see because it hasn't been damaged. The interesting thing here is that Ptolemy had no idea that you could go around Africa. Ptolemy believed that Africa simply extended far to the south, and he thought it connected with Asia, and that there was an internal, that the Indian Ocean was sort of an internal lake. And so there wasn't really a way to get around Africa. So these maps were revolutionary because they showed Europeans that in fact one could go around Africa in order to get to both the Middle East and India and China and eventually Japan. So these are called Ptolemaic maps, and you'll notice that Europe is fairly well defined, and then areas of the East are not well defined at all. These are areas that Ptolemy only had by verbal reports, and those verbal reports were clearly very, very general. And so you just have, mountains and rivers, a few inland lakes, but nothing is done terribly carefully. He simply didn't have that much information. Whereas Africa is very well defined because the European sailors had gone from port to port along the coast of West Africa and mapped that area of the region. And Columbus definitely had a Ptolemaic map like this on board, and these maps remained very popular. If you saw Jim Ackerman's lecture at the opening, these will eventually become atlases. And you'll have a map of the world like this, and then you'll have atlases, then you'll have pages that break that down into maps of Asia and Europe and Africa, and then eventually maps of the New World of North and South America as those are discovered and explored. The other major maps that medieval people used, we call TO maps. And they're not really maps in the traditional sense of the word, rather they're diagrams. And if you looked at a diagram like this, you might think that Europeans really did think that the world was flat, but they didn't. The myth that Columbus and his sailors feared that they would sail off the end of the earth is in fact a myth created in the 19th century by individuals who wanted to make medieval people look even sillier than they thought they already were. In fact, it was a heresy to believe that the world was flat. One of the popes declared that because it went against certain biblical dicta about God stopping the earth and the heavens. So the map that you see in front of you is that it's a diagram. And the reason it's called a TO map is because it looks a little bit like a T that's been inscribed in an O. The top part of the T is Asia. The left part of the T here is lower left is Africa, and the lower right part of the T is Europe. The T itself are bodies of water. So the Mediterranean divides Africa and Europe. The Nile divides Africa and Asia, and the Don River divides Europe and Asia. Asia was thought to be twice the size of either Europe and Africa. And then surrounding them was water. So the entire rest of the earth was surrounded by waters. So this is a basic diagram, and this diagram could be fancied up. It could be made much more interesting by including both geographic and historical features. So here you can see that for medieval Christians, with a TO map like this, it's extremely easy to put Jerusalem at the center of that map, because it was in fact at roughly, very roughly, the intersection of the Nile and the Mediterranean. And so you can see there that Egypt has somehow migrated to Asia, and that it's not in Africa. If you looked at Africa, now this map has flipped Europe and Africa. So Africa's on your right, Europe's on your left. If you look at Africa at the very bottom, you see these pillars. And those are the Straits of Hercules. So the Straits of Hercules are just a strait between Spain and Morocco. And here it's been represented as pillars, even though, as any of you that have traveled to Morocco or Spain know, there are no actual pillars there. But it was one of those sort of geographic myths. And then to the left, you have Spain and Europe. To the lower left, you'll notice that there's a dark spot that's been rubbed off. And originally those were faces indicating the wind, but that is also where, if you were English, Irish, or Scottish, you would locate yourself. So England didn't see itself as part of the European landmass, but as an island off to the side of it, which obviously it was. I wanted to show you briefly one of the most fantastic maps in Yale's collection. This is an Islamic world map. And like the European world maps, it is a schematic map. So the map on your left is the map as it actually appears. The map on the right, Kristen Herdman has given us indications of where bodies of water are so that you can locate yourself in the map according to the sort of geographies that you might know. Robert Doherty was extremely helpful in helping with this map. I don't work with Islamic maps, but you can tell there's a tremendous similarity here between the TO map and the Islamic world map, these schematic maps. And that's because both come from the same source. Both of these are very likely derived from Arabic sources. And Ptolemaic maps were also derived from Arabic sources. They didn't come directly from the Greeks, but they came through the Arab world, which translated and built on Ptolemy's geography. And this is one of the books that's in the collection upstairs in the exhibit. This is a geographer from the 15th century called Gregorio Dotti. Gregorio Dotti was a silk merchant in Florence. He dies in around 1435. And he composes a book, which he calls the Sphera, the spheres. And part of that, he's looking at the Earth and the Moon, and he's curious about what causes eclipses and other planetary motions. And then in the last book, in book 4, to the right, you can see the diagrams that we've already seen, the TO map with Asia and Europe and Africa at the bottom. And then on the right is an encounter with a very different sort of map, whose origins really we're not entirely certain about. The map on your right is a segment of what's called a Portolan chart. What you're looking at there is, again, the Straits of Hercules. And the islands there are the Fortunate Islands that are in the Atlantic. And the first city there is Fez in Morocco. And what Dotti did was, throughout the margins of his manuscript, he broke up Portolan charts, which I'll talk about in a moment, and he put them in the margins of his work as a didactic text. So you could locate the geography that he was discussing. Jim Ackerman, in his talk 2 weeks ago, talked about the sort of first atlases. And he puts Dati's book as atlas, as he said, with a lowercase a, meaning it is a collection of maps that has a logical order to them, but it's not yet the sort of atlas that's encompassing all of the territories and all done to the same scale. So this Portolan map is really what concerns a large part of the exhibit. So I wanted to talk a lot about these before moving on to questions. The first Portolan chart that we know of is called the Carte de Pizan. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and it dates from the 13th century. It's partial. It has mostly areas of the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Although there might have been more to the map, it really is a fragment. And it looks very much like a map of the Mediterranean. So what you see before you is not an actual Portolan map, but a Portolan map that Kristen Herdman has overlaid with color so that you can actually see it. And when I show you some of the actual Portolan maps, you'll see why I wanted to start here. And that's that the coastline in Portolan maps is very faint, and in fact made up of the names of cities. So those little lines that you see coming out of the coastline are the names of ports. Traditionally, the black ports were smaller ports and the red ports were major ports. This is a very late Portolan. You can see from the inset that it has the entire world, including North and South America. And in fact, this is a Portolan chart from the 17th century. But I wanted you to see it because it gives you a good sense of what a Portolan chart looks like. The other fun thing about Portolans is their shape. You can see that it's made out of a single animal skin, and that the neck of the animal is still intact. And you rolled up the map, and then you use the neck to sort of protect the map itself. There's been debate about the extent to which surviving Portolan charts were used on board ships to navigate. This is an open question. We don't have a lot of surviving Portolans that show where. And so it's very possible they were used on board ship and then were destroyed. But the maps that we have for the most part are in very good condition. This is the oldest Portolan in Yale's collection. This is from 1403 and from a cartographer called Francisco Becarius. And it's very hard to see, which is why I wanted you to see the first one. But if you look carefully to your left, you can see the Straits of Gibraltar in Spain. You can see the Boot of Italy. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the Black Sea. This is fairly accurate. And if you consider the fact that it was made from dead reckoning, that is from going from port to port, it's extremely impressive in its perceived accuracy. I remember that Europeans at this point do not have a way of getting this particular view. There's no hot air balloons, there's no airplanes, there's nothing that could give you this perspective on the Mediterranean, and yet nonetheless, they were able to put this map together. You'll notice that England is represented, but the northern areas of Germany are not yet, and those will get filled in on later maps. So we do know that these maps start out in the Mediterranean. They're made by Italians, they're made by Spaniards, they're made by people at Majorca, but they're not made initially in England or the Low Countries or France. That comes in later generations. And this is a map that was probably used to make other maps. You'll notice that there's very little color in the map itself, and some of the colors we know were added much later. We've done pigment analysis on this, and some of the pigments are Prussian blue, which is the first manufactured pigment. So I think this was a map that was being used to copy other maps. And what those maps looked like typically was this map here. This map is the oldest surviving and dated Portuguese Portolan chart. And unlike the one you've seen before, it has an extensive use of color on the inland. Notice if you're actually traveling by sea, you don't really need the inland features shown. Those are for landlubbers like myself. And so one of the perceived uses of these maps is by business people who wanted to know where they were shipping their goods, what territories were under the control of what suzerains, because they needed to know what taxes they needed to pay, and similar questions. The really interesting thing about these Portuguese charts is they show much more of the west coast of Africa than earlier charts had. And in fact, this chart goes so far down the coast of Africa that they needed to put an inset. So in the middle of Africa, they've continued the coastline. So that's what you see there. There isn't some weird little aberration, but that's the coastline of West Africa. And this map goes as far as Sierra Leone. The other fun thing about Portolans is they do have lots of information that has nothing to do with sailing. So if you look to the very far right, you'll see a red blob, and that red blob is the Red Sea. The Red Sea is almost always red or orangish, and it often has a land bridge, which you can see there at the end of the map. And the land bridge is where Moses and the Jews escaped Pharaoh. And interestingly, of course, as the text continues, after the Jews go through the Red Sea, God closes it off and Pharaoh's troops drown. But these maps were historic. They showed very important historic events in that way. And so that's why you have the land bridge across the Red Sea. If you look to the north, again, Germany isn't really well represented. Scandinavia isn't. It's just not an area that these Portuguese are concerned with. They're concerned with the trade around Africa. This is the map that we saw before with that Kristen had done the nice outline for. And this is what late Portolans look like. So this is from 1590. And what you can see is that the inner spaces of the land has been filled up almost entirely with all sorts of things that have nothing to do with sailing but are pretty. So compass roses, which we see on earlier maps, become much more complex. The inlay of the New World, so that you know that you're not just looking at you're looking at just at one part of the world. The orientalizing features of the map itself. So camels, elephants, and you can see there a little unicorn that has snuck into, I think, Libya, which is sort of interesting. The Red Sea isn't red, although it's outlined in red, and it still has a little land bridge, if you're able to see that there. And then the peoples. So most of Africa and the Middle East and Turkey are under Ottoman control at this period. And so they're represented with warriors wearing robes and curved blades. And if you look at the Straits of Gibraltar, this map happens to have an Ottoman Turk staring across the Straits of Gibraltar at a Spanish knight who's carrying the typical straight sword of the Europeans. But those big blue blobs above Italy are Venice, Genoa, and other large cities. So by the 1590s, these maps have become something else. They've become objects that are pretty. They've become art, things you'd hang up, and probably not things that would be terribly useful if you were traveling on board ship. So I only have a few more minutes left. I wanted to end with one last European map that I find fascinating. This one is very late, 1619. And I believe it's showing the economic features of colonialism. If you look at Africa, you'll see that the one city that's got a castle is the Castle de Mina. And this was a very large slave trading post that was originally Portuguese, but by 619 had fallen to the Dutch, and that's why it has a Dutch flag. If you look across the Atlantic to South America, you'll see that Brazil is represented. And above Brazil, you have two lines. One of them is horizontal, and that's the equator. The other one is vertical, and that's the line that was originally established with the Pope that separated the world between Portugal and Spain. Portugal got everything east of the line, and Spain got everything west of the line. Traditionally, Spain was not a slave state, although we know that obviously was not true, but they were not supposed to enslave people, whereas the Portuguese were comfortable with that. And in fact, in Brazil, slavery continues until 1881. That particular part of Brazil is where Europeans find diamonds, gold, silver, as well as sugarcane and coffee. And sugarcane in particular required a huge amount of slave labor because it was simply horrific work that you could not hire people to do. And so what I think this map represents is the movement of Africans from Africa to Brazil, the movement of coffee and sugar to Europe, and the movement of gold back down to Africa to pay for African bodies to continue the cycle. So this is a Portolan map. It still has those features that we saw before, where you can see the coastline and the names of all of the ports, but it probably wouldn't have been used to travel across the Atlantic. They had much better wayfinding tools at this point. Instead, I think this highlights both an economic and a cultural situation that existed in the early 17th century. So I'm going to stop there. I've talked to you for a little bit longer than I was supposed to, but I apologize for that. And I'm very happy to take questions or to make clarifications.
Great. Thank you so much, Ray. And I wanted to shout out everyone in the audience. We have 250 people attending live. It shows the interest that people have in your exhibition, as does the door count that we've seen upstairs. And I wanted to start by asking a question, and I'll probably ask Kristen the same. The labels for this are really wonderful. And I wonder if you could just talk some as you were putting these items together and writing the labels, which everyone can read, obviously, if you come to the exhibition, but the accessible PDF is also posted online, so you can see the labels wherever you are. But talk some of your process for putting the labels together, because they really are good models.
Thank you so much. And Kristen, if you're there, please feel free to chime in. I'm sorry that I can't see you on my view. We wanted to say, first off, both Kristen and I wanted this to be an exhibit that was really open to the public. We wanted it to be something that anybody could come in on their lunch hour and look at 3 or 4 maps and enjoy that. And we didn't want to weigh the exhibit down with a tremendous amount of supporting text. And so essentially what we were trying to do was to engage in a conversation. Here are 3 or 4 salient points about each of these maps, and then leave that up to the viewer to make further conversation about that. And also I wanted to point out Megan Checky was very helpful, because she indicated in an article that studies had indicated that most people spend between 3 and 4 minutes reading a label. So if you've written a label that's longer than that, they're only going to read the first 3 or 4 minutes of it. And so taking that into mind, we sort of reverse engineered it and tried to put together labels that would hold people's attention for 3 to 4 minutes, but didn't require a great deal more than that. The space itself also, the Beinecke doesn't have a linear layout, as anyone knows that's been here. And so you couldn't assume that somebody had seen one part of the exhibit before another. And so this exhibit doesn't assume that you've looked at other parts of the exhibit first. It takes each little piece and hopefully makes that understandable. And then you are able, as you walk through the exhibit, to put those pieces together yourself.
Great. It's clearly working. People are really spending time engaging with the labels and the items, and it's really great. We have lots of great questions, and encourage anyone who's got questions to post them in the Q&A. The first one from one of our ardent Mondays at Beinecke viewers is a great one. Who over time would have had access to observing these maps? What do we know about the audience for these maps?
So we do know that the maps themselves, some of the maps I've shown you, the early Ptolemaic maps of Martellus from 1490s, some of those actually do reflect contemporary knowledge about exploration. But for the most part, the Portolan charts, the ones that I showed you at the end, those tend to be more historical. They tend not to have the most up-to-date information on them. So they were probably used in the same way that we might use a map in a classroom, or if we were a business and we wanted to strike out under new territories, we might use this to get a sense of the closest trading partners and some of the political, let's say, dynamics. So, for example, the fact that after 1453, the Ottomans really have a lock on most of the Mediterranean and Africa and Greece and Turkey. And so if you wanted a trade route, you could trade with England, you could trade with the Hanseatic League in Germany, but you were limited. You couldn't just sail to Palestine and trade your goods there. So I think that the audience they had was primarily sophisticated business people, humanists that were curious about geography, aristocrats that needed to know where their territories lay in relationship to other territories. But they probably didn't filter down much further than that. And for all of those audiences, a accuracy would not have been something that would have been vital. The people on board ship are the people that need great accuracy, and they probably used very different charts.
Great. What might have been the ways of copying or reproducing these maps?
So we can tell by looking at many maps that there was an exemplar, like that first map I showed you, and that then many maps were made from that first exemplar. So it was very much like copying a book. Probably the big difference is that the first part of the book was not the words. When you write a book, you do words first, then images. But the first part of the book was likely, or the map rather, was likely the compass roses and then the outlines of the territories. Only after that was established would the text person come in and write the name next to all of the ports. But because these were copied like books, there wasn't a whole lot of infusion of new knowledge. New knowledge came in very distinct chunks. It wasn't one of those things where, like, okay, it's 5 years later and now we've updated our maps. Most of the map makers that we can trace were tracing essentially the same maps for 20, 30, or 40 years.
We have many kudos to you, so I'll share some of those as we go along.
Thank you.
One of them says, thanks very much, brilliant talk. And it goes along with the question, which is, could you tell us about false or invented places that regularly appear on maps in this period?
Yes. So I'm sorry it's difficult for me to go back to slides and actually point to them, but there are lots of things that are either erroneous or fictional. The fictional ones, probably the most interesting, is Prester John. And the legend of Prester John was that he was a king who would come and save European Christians from whatever infidels were attacking them, and that audience changed over time. And Prester John is located sometimes in Asia, sometimes in Africa. It really varies, and it moves around, particularly as Africa is explored more and more. One of my favorite kind of fictitious things is the origin of the Nile. So if you were to go back to that early Portolan chart, the Martellus chart that looked at Southern Africa, you would notice that Martellus draws the source of the Nile in South Africa. And the reason for that is pretty obvious, that they don't have any idea where the Nile originates. That wasn't, I believe it wasn't until the 18th or 19th century that they finally figure out the origins of the Nile. And so they're just guessing. They're sort of, other map makers have said, oh, it goes all the way down to the, the edge of Africa. So they simply begin drawing it like that. So those are the sorts of things that we see. We see mountain ranges, particularly inland features that have not yet been explored. And as Europeans begin to explore more thoroughly, those gradually go away. George Miles used to show the map of Lewis and Clark map. And for a long time, Americans thought that there was a river passage that went east-west across the Rockies. And so this is one of the things that a lot of maps draw in, thinking that, okay, we just have to find it. And of course, it isn't until Lewis and Clark go and other explorers go that we realize, okay, there really isn't an east-west passage in the same way. I hope that was answering your questions. There aren't places like Atlantis or other things like that that are represented. But there are sort of places where there's just a lack of knowledge, and so people fill in that vacuum with fictional material.
It's terrific. We had a question, I won't quote it exactly, but asked about compass roses, and I wonder if you can just use that as a prompt, talk a little bit about compass roses and their uses beyond decoration.
So this is a really hard one because, as I said, I'm a landlubber and I don't sail. So anything that I say that's erroneous from a sailing perspective, I entreat you to fix that. So the compass roses themselves, you can see that they're used to structure the Portolan charts. We can tell that they were the first objects drawn on the chart, and that they were then used to place the various land masses on the chart. But of course, that's not of interest to the people sailing. And so what I've been told is that the compass rose enables you to chart a course across the Mediterranean. If you know where you begin and where you end up, you're able to use the compass rose to help you navigate. They do have compasses in this period. In fact, one of the books that Jim Ackerman showed us actually had a compass in the cover of it, which I think is absolutely fantastic. It was a like quarter-sized compass in the cover. But how you would use a compass in relationship to the compass rose is not something I understand. I'm sorry, that was a historian's answer to that question.
A number of people commented on things seeming upside down or being south-north orientation. And so could you talk about south-north versus north-south orientation and what it means?
Sure, that's a fantastic question. First off, I did want to briefly mention the word to orient. So to orient, as it might sound like, is to find east, right, on a map. And that was because early Christians, to them, their most important point was in the east. They believed that Jerusalem was the most important city. They also believed that Eden lay all the way far to the east. And so when the end times came and human beings would sort of be healed of all their sins, they would actually travel back up to Eden, that Eden was a physical place on the map and that it was the furthest distance east you could get. That wasn't your actual question, but your question about orienting sent me in that direction. One of the fun things about Portolan charts, and one of the great things about Carrie and Megan and mounting this exhibit, is we were able to use the flat cases on the first floor of the Beinecke so that you can actually get at least 3 sides of many of these maps and 2 sides of other maps. Portolan charts don't have a right side up or an upside down. And I can't tell you how many times people have said, oh, the map is upside down, because of course, some of the text is. But if you look carefully, some of the text will always be upside down and others will always be right side up. And in fact, there is no strict orientation. And this is because you don't need a strict orientation if you're using these to travel across the Mediterranean. It doesn't need to be, the text doesn't need to be one direction. And in fact, you need to be able to go around the coast. And as you turn the map, then the coastline, those are the things that will be reading left to right to you. But you're very right. So it always appears that some of the text will be upside down, but it's one of the hard things about Portolan maps. And when they're displayed on a wall, then it looks sort of odd. But having them flat in these cases, you can actually walk around it and see the different perspectives.
Thank you so much. What might you be able to say about how distances and directions were measured to provide data from which maps could be made?
So even in the ancient world, they had units to measure nautical miles. One of the interesting maps that we have, that first map that I showed you by Becarius, he has a whole inset of text that says that earlier cartographers had actually gotten the length of the nautical mile wrong, and therefore the maps themselves had been distorted, and that he, Becarius, was, in talking with sailors, had restored it to its proper length. And so we know that there were sort of standard units of measurement, and almost every Portolan chart will have a bar on it that is supposed to indicate scale, a scale bar of some sort. The problem is that it's very difficult. Those measurements, for example, are very rough. So we actually have written Portolans, which are listings of ports and the nautical miles between them. But they're very general, 15, 20, 30. They don't get, terribly specific. And certainly to a layman, they don't look like they're terribly accurate. So I have a feeling that a lot of the information that was around was very general, and people relied a lot on their memory and the passed on information that would have been passed on orally from one captain to the next as they went over time, from one navigator to the next. And so there was certainly a school part of the education where you could learn how to use an astrolabe, you could learn how to use a compass, you could learn how to use these maps. But then the more important part of your education would be learning what was actually out there and how long it would take you to sail from one port to another, despite the sort of very vague information that exists in the records that we have today.
That's great. There's many indicators of how popular this exhibition is. One I can tell you, Ray, is when I've been leading tours of the building, I find I have to herd people more because they've fallen behind. They're looking at the cases and so taken by the exhibition. And that's true of many items, including Galileo and Starry Messenger. And so I wanted to just raise Starry Messenger. You covered a couple things in this introductory talk. The show contains multitudes, and again, encourage everyone to come and see it either on site and or online. The brochure is available online as well as on site. But talk a little bit about the inclusion of Starry Messenger in this show.
Yes, and that was Kristen Herdman's case. So if she's there, she might want to talk more about it. Are you there, Kristen? Okay, I assume she's not, so I will pick up with that. Sidarius Nunc is, oh, there she is.
If she's willing to join us, but you maybe can go ahead and talk a little bit and see if she's able to.
Okay, I will start. Sidarius Nunc is Galileo's publication in which he draws the entire moon. And he's using a telescope, and he's one of the first people to use a telescope. And so using the telescope, he's able to see what we call the dark side of the moon, right? So he's able to see that in fact, the moon isn't luminous. The moon isn't shining light on us, but that the moon is a big rock that is reflecting sunlight at us. And so that's essentially what the message is that Galileo is sending out. And the reason we ended with, as much as you can't, I said you can't begin and end, but that's sort of the latest piece. And the reason we ended with that was in looking at world maps, there's something, Europeans start out by thinking that the Mediterranean is the center of the world. And so that's all the world is. And outside of that, there's just water that circulates around the earth. And it isn't until you start to expand that and you get a sense of the earth as a planet that you have a very different sense of community, that you're not simply French or German or Arab or Turk, but you're all members of this group on a planet. And so in the back of that case, we had the first picture of Earth taken from the moon. It's called Earthrise. You probably know the famous one, which is in color, that was taken by the astronauts when they arrived on the moon. But I believe in 1966, a lunar craft, a module, actually took several pictures of the Earth in black and white. And there's something about the Earth rising over the moon that looks tremendously like the moon in Galileo's woodcuts. And so that's why we sort of ended with Galileo, was there was that nice sense of, the first person to really see the moon and to know what it was. And then, the first people, or the first object, I guess, to see Earth from the moon and to understand it as a planet. So for us, that was kind of a capping event. Kristen, are you still, I can see you, but oh, you're there. Do you want to talk about that? Yes.
Yes, just very briefly. I think Ray summarized it really well, but it's this object, or this group of objects, that allows us to sort of nod towards both the past and the future of mapping as well. Because, once you've mapped the Earth, where else are you going to continue your investigations? But also the history of the development of maps is tied up really closely with studying the heavens, finding out how to navigate by the stars. If you walk around the exhibit, you'll find a number of different treatises dealing with things like the astrolabe, which obviously is passed into European tradition via Arabic texts. But it's, it's a nice way to connect both the past and the future of mapping in this beautiful case with this object that I think a lot of people get excited to see.
Great, thank you so much, Kristen. And Kristen will be presenting on November 7th. So put a pin in that date. Put a pin on every Monday at 4 o'clock. But Kristen will be back for a presentation on November 7th. Thanks for joining on that. A few more thanks for a great talk. A question about where in Europe Portolan charts were made. Were they mostly Southern European? Were they Dutch? So just talk a little bit, Ray, about where within the European context Portolans were primarily made.
Before 1500, Portolans are primarily made along the southern Mediterranean. There's a Genoese school, there's a Mallorcan school, there's a Catalan school. And by schools, these were people that were all drawing maps in a similar way. And so there were many maps being drawn in those areas, but the map makers themselves traveled a lot, but they tended again to travel along the coast of the Mediterranean. We have some maps that are really fascinating that aren't made in Southern Europe. One of them was made by a European who was kicked out of Spain in 1492. His name was Jacobus Abendzara. And in 1492, the Jews were kicked out of Spain. And so he took his craft with him and he made 2 maps in Egypt, one in Alexandria, one in Cairo. And then he made one in a town called Safed in present-day Israel. And that's the one that we have from 1505. So it's very unusual. We don't know of many that are made outside of Europe, but because of the expulsion, this one was, and weirdly, it's the only one we have that's made on goat skin. All the rest are calf skin or sheepskin, and that probably had to do with local conditions and what he was able to do. After 1500, there are more Northern European makers, particularly the English. As you probably know, the English are seafaring people. They take these Portolan charts fairly quickly. And we have several from a family called the Cumberford family. And those are also in the exhibit in the flat charts. They do look very different than their southern compatriots. They tend to use very different colors. They're more pastel-y colors. And the territories are shaped slightly differently. And their emphasis is also different. They are concerned with trade with the Hanseatic League and other German groups. And so you're going to see on English charts that they will do Scandinavia and Northern Germany and those areas. So before 1500, mostly Southern European. After 1500, you do add to that. But it again is pretty regional. We don't have German ones. We don't have a whole lot of French ones, although we do have some from Marseille. But yeah, it tends to be a Southern European phenomenon in terms of makers. When it moves into print, so when you have atlases and things like that, then it does become European-wide, and Germans become very much involved in print aspects of making maps, but not in these hand manuscript maps.
We have comments such as brilliant exhibit, people who've been to see it. Question, I'm impressed by the accuracy of the shapes of the country, e.g. Italy. Can you say more about what they did going from port to figure out distance and coastline shapes?
Yes, so I agree with you. And it's one of the things that really fascinated me the first time I saw the Portolan chart as well, was that the outline of the Mediterranean is not perfect, but it's darn close. And how do you do that going from port to port? And there are several answers. None of them is, entirely satisfactory. One of them is that Ptolemy and many others before him working in the ancient world had actually measured the latitude of many cities, which you could do by putting a stake in the ground during the summer solstice and measuring the angle that's thrown off of the stake. And so there's a way you can do latitude, but what you can't do is longitude. And we think that that's why Ptolemaic maps, as well as the Portolan charts, if you looked at Italy, its angle is really much sharper than it actually is. So Italy is probably about here, but it gets represented here. And that might be because of problems gauging longitude relative to latitude. The other thing is, though, is that they really do seem to have been able to put together these maps like the Martellus map, just going from port to port to port. And they do, over time, get better. So they start out sort of cartoonish, and then they end up with something very accurate. Again, we don't know exactly who starts doing this. We don't know, why they start doing it, and we're not entirely sure how. It's pretty easy to say once you have one, it's easy to copy from one to the other. But the people that are pioneering this, that are the ones actually drawing new coastlines, how they're able to do that with such accuracy, just going from port to port, is one of those things where we just think it was very good, very accurate measurements and very creative map making.
Somewhat related in terms of the detail, please talk about the names of the coastal cities and that there were so many that the Europeans actually know that level of detail.
No. There are whole areas, particularly in Northern Africa, where they're traditional. They're copied from one map to the next, but there likely were not even cities in many of the places where those ports were labeled. You'll also notice that there's all kinds of other things like that weren't, there were mountains in the Sahara that don't exist that are also labeled. So Europeans' knowledge of the names of cities outside of the northern parts of the Mediterranean was sketchy. It was mainly through classical sources like Ptolemy that they received that, and Ptolemy himself had never been to any of these places either. So a lot of them are simply either fictitious or cities that may have died over the 2,000-year period that we're looking at.
Terrific. We're coming up on 5 o'clock, so I'll have one final question for you. Just a program note again, we'll be back next Monday with Chet Van Duzer talking about the Martellus map. And I have pasted a link to the registration for that. And also on Monday, October 10th at 2 p.m., there'll be an online symposium, as Ray noted, on the Vinland map. The link to register for that is also in the chat. And if you're on the Beinecke email list, you'll also see reminders about that. So please come to those if you can and share that with friends and colleagues. This talk has been recorded, and the talk itself will be posted on the Beinecke YouTube channel within the next week or so, so you can revisit it and also share it with friends. As a last question, Ray, and before I do a few more, there's lots of exclamation points in the Q&A. Thank you, so fascinating. Many other kudos for the exhibition and for this talk. So on behalf of the 250 plus people who've been live online, thank you. My final question is, you know this subject, have looked at these maps and Portolans many times over time, but in putting this exhibition together, what sort of new learning stands out for you? What have you learned in curating the exhibit?
Yeah, it's one of those things where every map has an incredible depth, and so I had only touched the surface of a lot of these. One of the things that really surprised me was just how many maps that Yale has. We had divided the collection into 2 different collections, and so when you brought them together, it was really a substantial number of maps. The thing that really, though, completely took me by surprise was how late Portolan charts go. So in fact, the latest Portolan chart that we have in the collection was cataloged by Todd Fell, and it was a map that Yale didn't know it had until the map room was cleaned out, and Todd found this map and cataloged it. It was from 1789, and it was from the coastline of Brazil. And nowadays, it was it's kind of like a Gold Coast. It's where you would go for very expensive high-end shopping and beautiful beaches and that sort of thing. But as I mentioned before, this was the coast of Brazil that was important for minerals, for sugarcane, and for coffee. at the time. I had no idea anyone was making maps as late as the 18th century. And so that was the carrying on of the style of Portolans really surprised me that late. And then just the sort of the chance of finding a new map, a map that we didn't know we had, and trying to figure out, as you can see from these maps, they don't give you a whole lot in terms of why they were made. And so trying to figure out why would somebody in the 18th century have wanted a map whose origins begin in the 13th century. So I think that was the primary thing that I learned. Kristen, do you have something you wanted to add? Because I know these were new for you too.
Yeah, so it's been a real pleasure working on this. So I come from a manuscript background, but I don't necessarily come from a mapping specific background. So this was like a huge learning curve to catch up with something that Ray's been doing for such a long time and is so passionate about, but it's been just so much fun. I think the thing that I learned doing this exhibit is that when it comes to either like how you orient a map or what you put in the center of the map, all of this is really culturally contingent. And thinking about how other people map the world, have mapped the world, or will map the world, I think is important for understanding how other people think about the world.
Those are both great notes to close on. Thank you both. Thank you, Ray, for leading the talk, and encourage everyone to see the show on site if you can, online for sure, and to join us next Monday and for subsequent Mondays. Have a great afternoon, everyone.